This is India. Its mountains and great plains bound together by a net of steel. The railways, built during British rule. The British built canals, too, to water the land. They opened up the wilderness, transforming it into tea gardens and plantations. The British had been in India as rulers for nearly 200 years, building splendid palaces and monuments all over this vast country. Today, many stand silent and deserted, but in the 1930s, it was all very different. The Viceroy, as representative of the King Emperor, headed the government of that part of the country known as British India, and life was generally good for the few thousand British who ran it. The Indian Army was the largest in the empire. Most of its officers were British and white, but the troops were Indian. In the country, the government relied on the district officers. A young man in his 20s might well be in charge of an area as large as some British counties. But there were not nearly enough British to rule India, so much of the work was done by Indian officials and businessmen. Indian princes governed the rest of India, but all agreed to British control over defense, foreign policy, communications, and trade. In return, they were allowed to run their own states as they wished. Many were extremely rich, and there were some 600 states altogether. They had their own private armies, mainly for show. The princes and large landowners were regarded as friends and allies by the British. But life for the rest of the 350 million Indians was not nearly so comfortable. In the country, they had to cope with difficult soils and harsh landlords. Most were very poor. There was extreme poverty in the crowded cities. Life was hard for most Indians. Religion was a powerful force in their lives. 2/3 of the population were Hindu, to whom all living things were sacred, including the holy rivers, like the Ganges. Many would travel hundreds of miles hoping to purify themselves in the waters of these sacred rivers. Hindu temples were covered with statues and carvings of their many gods and goddesses. Hindu festivals were celebrated with offerings and song and dance. One of the most famous Hindus was Gandhi, a leader of the Congress Party. He stood up for the ordinary Indian. He believed in the value of Indian village life and crafts. Gandhi thought that all Indians should be free, self-governing and self-respecting. especially the untouchables, Hindu outcasts who were given disagreeable jobs. He believed that Indians, not the British, should rule India, and that if they refused to cooperate with the government, British rule would collapse. At that time, salt was taxed by the government, which, as Gandhi pointed out, made it too dear for ordinary people. So, in 1930, he led a march to the sea, where he encouraged people to make their own salt and so avoid paying the salt tax. But he didn't believe in violence. These campaigns won him mass support and put the British on the defensive. Unfortunately, they did often end in violence. In September 1931, Gandhi came to London to attend a conference to discuss India's future. Princes and other representatives from India came too. Gandhi claimed that only his Indian Congress Party could speak for all Indians. The other members disagreed with him, and the conference failed after 3 months of discussion. A vast crowd awaited his return to India. After his arrival, he discovered that Nehru, the other great Congress leader, had been arrested. Nehru admired Gandhi very much, but thought he was too old-fashioned in his religious ideas and wrong in his belief in the value of village crafts. Nehru saw India developing as a modern industrial country. Only then could she be strong and independent of the British. Personally, he said, I dislike the praise of poverty and suffering, nor do I appreciate in the least the idealization of the simple way of life. I have almost a horror of it. His audiences heard a different argument from Gandhi's, but Nehru backed him in the struggle for freedom. The British government was determined to be tough with Congress. Time and time again, their leaders were arrested for demanding independence. Nehru himself was to spend a total of 14 years in prison. Jinnah was the other great Indian leader. He was not a Hindu like Gandhi and Nehru, but a Muslim. About a quarter of India's population were Muslims. Unlike Hinduism, which was a purely Indian religion, Muslims not only belonged to a worldwide religion, but had different habits and customs. The mosques where they worshipped were plain and unadorned. And Muslims worshipped only one god, Allah. In the past, Muslim emperors had conquered India and ruled in great splendor. Though most of them had been driven from their thrones by the British, their magnificent buildings were still reminders of past glories. The problem for Jinnah was how to win back for the Muslims their old pride, and a full share for his party, the Muslim League, in the government of India. But in the Indian elections in 1937, while Congress got control of the Hindu heartland, with clear majorities in 6 provinces, Jinnah's Muslim League had to share the other 3 with local Muslim parties. Frightened of Congress's power, Jinnah tried to bring all Muslim parties into his league. The next major development in Indian politics came in 1939, when Britain went to war with Germany. The Viceroy immediately announced that India would fight the Germans too. But he did this without consulting the Congress leaders and provincial ministers. They were outraged. and at Gandhi's insistence, resigned, so throwing away the power they'd achieved in the 1937 elections. However, the Indian Army remained loyal to the British, and its soldiers fought in many parts of the world. Many with great bravery. Then, in December 1941, the Japanese entered the war. Their victorious armies swept through Asia, crushing all resistance. The old European empires crumbled. In February 1942, the Japanese attacked and captured the Great British base at Singapore. It was one of the most humiliating defeats in the history of the British Empire. Over 130,000 troops were taken prisoner. The war was now virtually at India's doorstep. How would the Indians react? The British minister Stafford Cripps came to make sure of Indian support. He offered a share in the wartime government and the right to establish their own constitution after the war, either as a united India or separate Hindu and Muslim provinces. This angered Congress leaders who demanded a united India. They wanted the British out. Gandhi now no longer believed in British promises about independence. Congress called for a nationwide civil disobedience campaign unless the British left India. So the British arrested all Congress leaders and outlawed the party. There were protests throughout India. With the news of the Congress leaders' arrests, mass violence broke out. It's been estimated that about 10,000 people died. By the end of 1942, 60,000 were under arrest. Field Marshal Lord Wavell, the British commander-in-chief, was called in by the Viceroy to deal with the situation. To restore order, he had to bring in British troops, which were really needed to fight the Japanese. With Congress out of the way, Jinnah now seized his opportunity. He offered to cooperate with the British if Muslims could have their own homeland when independence came. The Japanese threat grew. Presenting themselves as liberators, they advanced through Burma right up to the borders of India. But they were forced back by Allied troops and at last were in full retreat. The end of the war was in sight. The British released the imprisoned Congress leaders in June 1945. They were invited to Simla with other leaders by Lord Wavell, now the Viceroy, to discuss a new Indian government. But the talks broke down because the Muslims and the Hindus couldn't agree. In 1945, Attlee became Prime Minister of Britain. He was committed to Indian independence, and he sent 3 cabinet ministers to meet Indian leaders and try and get an agreement on the constitution of a free India. At Simla, they met all the Indian leaders and agreed to the possibility of an independent Muslim state to be known as Pakistan. But yet again, the Indian leaders disagreed on how this was to be done. So the British minister offered them the choice between a united India with more power in the provinces or partition. In the meantime, India would be run by a new government consisting of representatives of the Indian political parties. The leaders of Congress and the Muslim League seemed to accept the plan. Nehru became Prime Minister of the new government, but then appeared to go back on his acceptance of the British plan and wanted a strong central government. This angered Jinnah, who called for a direct action day, virtually civil war on Congress. This day, he announced, we bid goodbye to constitutional methods. Muslims and Hindus began fighting. In Calcutta alone, nearly 5,000 people were killed in 4 hours. It was the start of a terrible time that lasted till after independence. As the rioting spread, it became more and more difficult for the British to keep control. Attlee decided to act. He announced that Britain would transfer power to an Indian government by June 1948. On the same day, he appointed Lord Mountbatten as the new viceroy. His job was to wind up the 200-year-old British Indian Empire in 15 months. He started by meeting all the Indian leaders and listening to what they had to say. He talked to Gandhi too, even though he wasn't a member of the government. To ensure success, Mountbatten was given greater powers than any other viceroy. Nehru, Mountbatten found, was a realist. He now accepted the idea of Jinnah's Pakistan. By cutting off the head, Nehru said, we'll get rid of the headache. Against a continuing background of Hindu and Muslim riots, the plan for dividing India was hammered out. Mountbatten realized that his power to control the events by force was running out. So he advanced the date of independence to August 1947. In June, the plan was accepted at last by all the Indian leaders. Everyone had had to make a compromise, spurred on by Mountbatten's skill and charm.
In my opinion, that plan provides the best...
On the 14th of August at Karachi, the Mountbattens attended the inauguration of the Dominion of Pakistan.
I'm speaking to you today as your viceroy. Tomorrow, the government of the...
Jinnah was the Governor-General. Muslims now had their homeland, West and East Pakistan. The Mountbattens then returned to India. At Delhi on the 15th of August, Mountbatten was sworn in as the first Governor-General.
I will well and truly serve His Majesty, King George VI, in the office of Governor-General of India.
Nehru was then sworn in as Prime Minister. At last, Nehru had achieved what he and other Congress leaders had struggled for so long, independence. But behind the celebrations lay the problems of a violent partition in the Punjab and Bengal, which was to cost 500,000 lives. For those lucky enough to escape the killing, it meant painful journeys from one part of the country to the other. Muslims leaving India and Hindus fleeing from Pakistan. 1948 was to be the year of the refugees. It was perhaps ironic that the railways, which had helped to unite British India, now carried its people apart.